Thank you all, everyone, so much for being here. It's great to be with 42 desirable, wonderful community members. We appreciate you joining us today. We're so lucky to have some incredible panelists. I'm going to pull back up our PowerPoint presentation, just go through a couple quick slides about the day so you know what's in store. If you'll give me a moment on that. So our schedule, we're gonna do a quick little introductions on Catalyze SV, go through a little bit of the day. We are asking for questions in the chat function, so keep that in mind. We wanna introduce our moderator in a moment, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. Your questions will be interspersed throughout today, so feel free to keep them coming. So a little bit about Catalyze SV. We're a nonprofit community group here in Silicon Valley. Our funding is from individual donors, governments, foundations, and actually some corporations as well. And this is our mission statement. We're all about how do we come together as a community to envision and create sustainable, equitable, and vibrant places. We want to thank a very big and special thanks to Excite Credit Union, who is our presenting sponsor, helping put on today's event. Anyone from Excite want to wave real quick or say hello if they're on the line?
Yes, thank you, Alex. This is Daisy, Community Relations Department. I'm hoping, this event's going to be great. And, we're very proud sponsors. Thank you for letting me say something. Alex, thank you.
Thanks, Daisy. A great credit union in our community. We're glad you're here in the community and here today helping put this on. Thank you so much for the support. And we also want to thank our supporting sponsors, San Jose Neighborhoods for All, the League of Women Voters of San Jose and Santa Clara, and Transform. If you're from one of those organizations, feel free to raise your hand or put any information you might like in the chat function. We're thankful for our supporting sponsors. In addition to Excite, they were helping get the word out about today. So thank you for that, for those groups. Here are our panelists we're very, very lucky to have today. We're gonna let you get introduced to them more if you'd like offline. We're not a big fan of reading really impressive bios about people during meetings. Today's about a chat. So this is just the folks who are gonna be here with us, and feel free to follow up on our Eventbrite where we link to biographical information about them. And we're so very lucky that they're here today to share their experiences in their cities. So I think I will stop things there. In a moment though, I just want to do quick housekeeping. Again, if you'd like ASL, American Sign Language interpretation, look for Kate Hidalgo. She's wearing a black blouse and she's got long brown hair in a ponytail. Want to thank our team member, Summer Manga, for helping put on today. She's been with us for a few months and we've had a great experience working with Summer. Thank you, Summer, for helping put on today. And again, we are recording this right now on Facebook Live and YouTube. So feel free to share it, comment in real time. If you're on Facebook Live right now, welcome. We're so glad that you're there, and Summer will be tracking any comments you might have or questions and trying to see if we can get those to our panelists. So I think a couple last ground rules, since we do have a few number of folks here, if you wouldn't mind staying muted, that would be appreciated. We do have some questions that the panelists and Lakshmi want to talk about, and so we'll go through those. If we have time, which we will, for a couple questions from the audience, we'll get to those. Thank you to the 2 community members who sent questions in ahead of time, and everyone else, feel free to add them in the chat section. And we're going to try to stay focused on this question of opportunity housing and duplexes, also known as zoning reform or single family zoning. Other things, Lakshmi as our moderator will probably reroute to another time or discussion. We are hoping to do a second discussion about opportunity housing later this year in probably around June, featuring some of the different perspectives people have here in our community about the issue. So tonight is all about perspectives from people from other places around the country who have worked on this issue, And hopefully we'll have a chance later to talk with some of our community members and leaders about the issue. All right, I am so fortunate to turn things over to Professor Laxmi. She's going to lead today's discussion. Thank you, Professor Laxmi, and our panelists for being here. It's all yours.
Thank you, Alex. And thanks everyone for being here. My name, like Alex just said, is Laxmi Ramasubramanian, and I'm the Department Chair of Urban and Regional Planning at San Jose State University. The topic that we're here to talk about is important and creates deep emotions when you hear about the topic, and it creates a lot of anxiety, but at the same time, there's also a lot of energy that it generates, and it's great to energize the community to come together to talk and discuss these issues, right? But to get us started at the discussion, we have some three great panelists here who have experience or are attempting to take on this challenge in their communities. And so what I thought I'd do is to begin by letting each panelist tell a little bit of their story from their own community so that it sets the stage, a context, to after which we can pivot to some questions about our community. And so without further ado, let me start by, again, welcoming our panelists and opening it up to you. How and why did your city decide to take on densification, opportunity housing, or as we call it? So you can give us the context and frame it, and also give us some details so that we can get into some of the nitty gritty as well. Thank you. May I invite Lisa to get started?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Bender. I am the City Council President in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we have been working on zoning reform and expanding housing options in our city for a number of years. I first took office in 2014. And during my first term in office, for the first 4 years, I chaired our zoning and planning committee. So I led a lot of the work that we've done around housing policy in Minneapolis, in part because my ward makes up about 30,000 people in our city of 420,000 people. So we're a smaller sized city. But we're also, of course, 2020 was an anomaly in so many ways and a really tough time in a lot of our communities. But in the recent years, our city has been growing. So folks are moving in from all over. We're outpacing the growth of many of the suburbs that had seen expansion in previous decades. And in some ways, our housing stock is well suited to change. And there were also a lot of gaps in the available housing stock for all the folks who are moving in. So we have seniors who are aging out of their neighborhood, their single family homes, they may want to move, but there's no other options in their neighborhoods besides single family homes. We have multi-generational immigrant families who are having a hard time finding housing that suits their needs, and then everything in between. A little bit more than 50% of our city rents. And actually a lot of folks in Minneapolis live alone. So there's also a need for single unit housing in our city. So that's a little bit of our context. We're a growing city with some gaps in our housing stock and a lot of interest from folks in our community to address our very large racial disparities that we have in Minneapolis, as well as take local action on climate change. So as we're approaching all of these different policy discussions, it's really in the context of growth, a real interest in race equity and in climate justice. So back in 2014, so all the change that we have made has been really incremental. So I think like a lot of changes in local government, change is slow and often very incremental, but can also be really profound. And I think my approach has been, and I've become even more convinced over time, that we get a new policy on the books, we often make compromises, and then we see how it works and we adjust over time. And so even in the 7 years I've been in office, we've made multiple adjustments to our different housing policies that we've adopted. So back in 2014, we first legalized accessory dwelling units citywide. We didn't require any parking in the new units, but we did make a compromise and only allow them in owner-occupied homes, which put a lot of limitation on parts of the city like the one I represent, where there's a lot of rental housing and a lot of need for housing. But there was concern about the pace of change, and so we made that compromise back then. We also adopted some parking reform, which had a lot of purposes, but was also, like the accessory dwelling unit policy, was allowing the kind of housing that we're hearing that people want. People really like the older housing stock, the historic buildings, the old walk-ups, smaller units. They don't really like these big, multiple, like whole city block projects as much as they like the smaller projects. And we found that those were mostly illegal in our city, that in a lot of parts of town, you couldn't add a new duplex or triplex. You couldn't add a second unit to your single family home. A lot of older housing stock, things had become illegal over time. So there were old duplexes and triplexes where the units were no longer legal. And those smaller apartment buildings were not possible to build, in part because of our parking requirements. So we reformed parking back in 2014. And then a couple of years later, we started a process of adopting a new city master plan. And it's called the Minneapolis 2040 plan. We spent a ton of time and energy really deeply engaging our community in that plan. We did a lot of different kinds of engagement than we'd ever done before, all with an aim to make our process really accessible and really open to folks who we didn't always catch through our traditional methods of community engagement. So we went out to cultural communities, we had staff at street festivals and street fairs, we had really family-friendly, accessible public meetings, we had childcare and food, and we really asked folks open-ended questions about what their life is like in our city, so that we can make our questions as accessible as possible and not jump right to the zoning code definitions and negotiating floor area ratio. And I think it really worked. Our city was able to have a discussion about all the things we need to make our city truly accessible and equitable. And we also took the time to learn about our city's history of racial exclusion in housing. And like a lot of cities in the country, when you take the old redlining map of our city that said where you could get a mortgage or not, and you line it up with the records we can find of racially restrictive covenants that barred people from owning homes based on their race or ethnicity or religion, and you compared it to our zoning map at the time, the maps all lined up. So our city's zoning code had codified the same patterns of racial exclusion that were present in racially restrictive covenants and in redlining. And if you ask most people in Minneapolis, they wouldn't be okay with redlining or racially restrictive covenants. And so we really took the time to understand how those histories were codified in our present laws. When folks came to public meetings, they could put a pin on their house and see how it lined up with those old redlining maps, just to build awareness about how some neighborhoods had developed over time with a lot more privilege than others. And it had really contributed to our housing patterns. As we were having this discussion, we really wanted to have a citywide policy discussion about housing choices and housing options, and not carve out certain parts of our city to be treated differently than others. And so eventually we adopted a plan which concentrated most of our growth near transit corridors so that we can really build on those goals of sustainability and equity. And we also legalized triplexes citywide to create more options for housing in neighborhoods across our city, where about 60% of our land area had previously been only allowing single family homes. Like I said, the change has been really incremental since 2014. Well, 2015 was the first year you could build an accessory dwelling unit, which is a granny flat or an additional unit in your home. We've permitted 158 accessory dwelling units in all of that time. And a lot of those were conversions of formerly illegal units, so that we get them on the, we're inspecting them, we're making sure people are safe. And then in the last year, when we've allowed for duplexes and triplexes citywide, we've seen 34 permitted duplexes. So that would be 68 units. and 16 permitted new triplexes. We saw 2020 was a weird year, of course, for all the reasons, and a hard year. But we also saw a little dip in single family home construction. So we'll have to see as it goes. It seems like maybe people are, when they're constructing a new home in our fully built out city, that maybe some of the new constructions are adding that extra unit instead of just simply building a single family home to give a little bit more flexibility for the use of that property. So that's a short version of our story in Minneapolis. I'll say we've also done a lot of other policy work around renter protections and making sure that renters are protected from eviction, as well as the really complementary transportation policies and investments, because our plan was so focused on concentrating housing near transit. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a very quick and comprehensive encapsulation of many years of work in your community. Lav, would you like to take the story from your community and maybe build some linkages with Lisa's narrative?
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Hey everyone, my name's Love Johnson. I am a former planner with the City of Portland, Oregon's Bureau of Planning Sustainability. I worked on their zoning code team during the time that we were doing our own sort of opportunity housing project, which here was called the Residential Infill Project. And I no longer work in that position, so I can officially say these views are my own and not that of my employer. But yeah, I will just echo a lot of what Lisa said. I think you gave a really great overview of some of the benefits of this type of housing, some of the history that has led to the exclusion of this type of housing in a lot of our city. I think Minneapolis and Portland were doing this work on timelines that were maybe a little bit different, but pretty aligned, and for a lot of the same reasons, seeing a lot of the same problems and trying to respond to them. But in Portland, our work got started around 2015 with this project specifically, the Residential Infill Project, when our mayor at the time, Charlie Hales, and the rest of City Council was hearing a lot of concern from mostly homeowners in our neighborhoods that were concerned about lots of demolitions happening, and specifically demolitions that were replacing houses with really big McMansions, if you will, right? Really sort of large and outsized with the scale of the neighborhood. And at the same time, 2015, we have been in a declared housing crisis in Portland since about that time. And awareness of our housing affordability problems was really growing and has been growing ever since then and hasn't stopped, right? So the project really evolved over time to become, not only about this question of demolition and McMansions, but also while we're changing the zoning code, how can we allow for different types of housing in, the 70% of our land that was zoned for single houses only? How can we allow for housing that's smaller, that's relatively more affordable, that's more environmentally sustainable? And so that became sort of the main thrust of the project over time. And after we got started, the city really started kind of sharpening our pens around studying potential impacts to displacement, right? How is this change going to impact lower income folks who are renters, people of color, who are in more precarious housing situations? And as Lisa said, this is definitely sort of one tool in the toolbox when we talk about housing. It's not just zoning, but it is renter protections, which we've also passed recently. It's affordable housing. Our region has passed a number of bonds to construct a lot more affordable housing. And it's houselessness provisions and services and things like that. So, knowing that this is one tool in the toolbox, we also, as Lisa mentioned, really started studying the history, our own history of racism in planning. Our team produced a report about that topic in Portland, how it manifested and how it led to some of the results that we see now. So that was all going on for a couple of years, and then kind of midstream, our state legislature actually passed a bill, House Bill 2001 in 2019, that sort of preempted us a little bit, or beat us to the end, if you will, by requiring what we were working on statewide. So in Portland, we were working on and eventually passed, the ability to build up to 4 units in single family zoned neighborhoods across the city, with some other provisions, including a bonus for deeply affordable units. And so the state legislature basically required that of the bigger cities across the state, up to 4 units in these neighborhoods, duplexes, triplexes, accessory dwelling units, all those things. So that was all kind of, those efforts were feeding off of each other. And finally, last year, the residential infill project passed in Portland and hasn't actually gone into effect yet. So we haven't been able to see what the impacts will be. But based on our own economic modeling and the modeling that we got kind of consulted out, real estate development modeling, we're expecting it to be also extremely incremental, right? I think we heard concern from a lot of folks that thought this was going to destroy their neighborhoods. We also heard a lot of excitement from activists who thought this was going to solve all the problems. It's definitely neither of those things, right? We estimated somewhere in the ballpark of 20 units per year to 200 units per year. Like as we were tweaking those zoning parameters, it's really just a small number, right? So that's what I think is what's going to happen once this policy goes into effect in August of this year. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Love. Greg, perhaps you can sort of round this conversation out by talking about your ongoing work in your community.
Sure. Yeah. Good evening, everybody. So yeah, I'm in more of the earlier stages than Minneapolis, Portland. We are in the middle of our general plan update, our 2040 general plan. Our city is committed to updating our general plan every 5 years. So it's like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. We just start over again once we finish in many ways. But one of the things we wanted to do was to take to council our key strategies, the most controversial aspects. One of them was to eliminate parking minimums citywide and establish parking maximums. But another one was to allow a greater variety of housing choices in our single family zones, with up to a 4-plex. So duplexes, triplexes, 4-plexes, maybe bungalow courts and whatnot. We're also looking at eliminating maximum densities in our general plan and just going to only a floor to area ratio model. So that would help to facilitate this as well. So contrary to what the New York Times said, you can't build a 4-plex right now in a single family zone in Sacramento. We just got approval of a key strategy. We hope to approve the general plan by the end of this year. And in the meantime, while we're working on the general plan, we'll be developing the zoning changes for what we're calling our missing middle housing standards, getting a consultant on board to open up the R1, R2, R1A zones to allow the more units and look at the setbacks, lot coverage, massing, all that. I get into that more later, I suppose. But the point is we're pretty far from allowing a 4-plex to be built. We're probably hope to have those standards adopted by summer of next year. As for why, again, yeah, racial equity. I think we've all heard where you live, your zip code can be a big factor in how long you live, particularly in this country. And Sacramento is a 100 square mile city with very diverse neighborhoods. Improving people's access to jobs, to quality schools, parks, amenities that people can walk and bike to, access to our urban forest. In our wealthier neighborhoods, we've got quite a good tree canopy that keeps things cool during the summer. So they're really appealing places to live, but they're also very hard places to access from a housing point of view. Richard Rothstein's Color of Law really got us thinking and really outlined the institutional racism that's been in housing for decades. And this seems like a starting point to address it in a practical way, not conclusively. We definitely anticipate a pretty slow start in this. in terms of number of housing units, but still it's something tangible that we can point to that we're trying to do to address this issue. And just housing choice in general, a place for kids to come back home from school and live in the neighborhood they grew up, empty nesters being able to live next to their kids, having a choice between a single family home and an apartment. And then of course, yes, density, sustainability, trying to move away from sprawl and building up, so more infill housing opportunities, utilization of our existing infrastructure, and then supporting transit with more ridership, increasing the ambient density in the city. So yeah, certainly when we had a city like Minneapolis move ahead, in Portland, we were inspired, hey, we can do this too. That definitely was a factor when looking at this. And we also, like just about everybody now in the country, we have a housing supply crisis. So we've been taking a variety of measures to streamline housing productions. ADUs, we now allow 2 per lot. We don't require parking for ADUs. We've been looking at a lot of housing. We're approving it administratively, if it meets standards and guidelines consistent with that, up to 200 units. So an alternative to SB 35, just one of the California laws. So yeah, we have a lot of folks moving in from the Bay Area, and our home prices continue to go up. But our city seems to really embrace growth and change, and our council's up for this. So
Thank you for getting us started, all of you. I have a couple of audience questions here that I want to share with you before I ask you my next question, which is really the next question that I have for you is to talk about the policy challenges that you face. But let me mix in some of the audience questions so that it gives some context of what our members are thinking about. So this is a question from Colin Black, and they ask, in not so privileged neighborhoods, families tend to double up in available housing. So the duplexes and triplexes and ADUs may have 2 families per unit. Infrastructure in these areas, roads, parking, parks, sewers, water, etc., is already overloaded with the existing single family zoning. So the question really is, who pays for the infrastructure needed for these upgrades to take place? And a related audience question is really, how has the private sector responded to the upzoning in your communities? And how are you managing the conversations with the private sector? So those are the audience questions, but maybe those can also relate to some of the policy challenges that you faced in your own communities. So anyone, if you can take this and get started.
I'm happy to jump in about the infrastructure question. I'm glad someone asked, because I really think that we have to do infrastructure and land use planning together as cities. And I think we're all doing a much better job of that than maybe happened in the past, or we're shifting the 2 at the same time, ideally. So in Minneapolis, we're also using a race equity lens to program our capital infrastructure. So for many decades in our city, our public works department was using measures and formulas to program capital dollars that really further privileged neighborhoods. So if you only reconstruct the roads that have the highest vehicle volumes, you're tending to invest in parts of the city that are already developed, rather than parts of the city that are highly residential but may have fewer destinations. At least that's how it plays out in our city. And so part of our efforts in recent years has been to flip our formulas for how we program capital dollars and to invest in parks and streets that are in neighborhoods that have higher concentrations of poverty or higher concentrations of communities of color. And again, in Minneapolis, those are communities that have paid property taxes for many years, are paying sales taxes, are contributing financially to our communities in many ways, but haven't had the same level of services and investments that the wealthier neighborhoods have. And so it's been a really important part of our overall goal is to invest in those communities and to make the amenities, you know, to really invest in those amenities in neighborhoods that are growing. We are also addressing occupancy. I know it's not exactly the question that was asked, but we had really outdated occupancy restrictions that reflected, you know, a nuclear family that really put restrictions on cooperative living or folks, unrelated adults living together. So we've modernized those to really focus on life safety and building safety issues and not really get our city's government into regulating if you have to be related to live together or not. Even our, you know, our housing co-ops were having trouble with those regulations. And then, you know, I said this, but I didn't give the full context. So in 2020, we had almost 4,000 new housing units built in Minneapolis. And just about 92 of them were duplexes or triplexes. Those were permitted in 2020. So will be built in 2021 or beyond. So again, this type of housing that we're talking about tonight is a very small fraction of the number of new units that we're seeing. Most of them are still in the larger multifamily buildings that are concentrated near transit. So we have seen continued investment in our city for multifamily housing, even though we adopted an inclusionary affordable housing requirement. And a lot of our developers said they would never build housing in Minneapolis again. We actually had the second highest year of development ever last year, which makes me think we should require more affordable housing than we compromised and did. So, you know, I think our plans are all working. We're seeing the kind of housing that we've planned for, where we want to see it along transit. We're getting the affordable housing that we've required as part of it. And we're seeing this very small incremental change in the residential neighborhoods that provides some more options and opportunity for folks.
Thank you, Lisa. Love or Greg, would you like to take on either the audience question or just talk about some of the major policy challenges that you faced in your community?
Well, I got the same question about who pays for infrastructure at a community meeting, and the answer is the developer pays for the impacts to infrastructure through either impact fees or exactions that we have them put in. So exaction would be an example of that is having them repave a portion of the alley, the closest part from the street to where the homes would be. If there's any impact to our drainage infrastructure, we would require on-site drainage facilities like swales or whatnot for any new impermeable surface. But sidewalk, curb, gutter improvements. So we'll definitely keep an eye on it. We don't have a whole lot of intensive growth anticipated. We've been checking in with the development community. I've had one inquiry about building a fourplex at this point. Generally, this is kind of I imagine this is going to be like a slow start. Just like ADUs, we now are approving about 5 ADUs a week in our city, whereas before it was you know, a couple years ago it was like 1 a week or less. So things are picking up in the ADU front, but I think it's going to take a while for the market to find those folks, so to speak, that have this niche of building a triplex or a fourplex and dealing with the complexities. Is an interesting ownership model, though, that we're going to be talking with one developer where it would be lease to own. You lease for 10 years and then you get to put money into a condominium, so to speak, for one of these units. So the idea of finding some type of alternative ownership model to create a opportunity for somebody to build equity instead of buying a really expensive home or renting at a really high rate increasingly. So that's exciting to see. Parking definitely is a tough policy issue to get to the next question. just history, when I started with the city in 2005, we were requiring one parking space for each bedroom for a new ADU. And then we did one space per ADU unit. Now we don't require parking, and we have a fair amount of ADUs coming in, and we're not really hearing a lot of concerns. I suppose if parking gets really bad, we have a residential parking permit program that can help manage the on-street parking supply. But in a single-family neighborhood, you have driveways and garages. Unlike in our Midtown area, where we have a lot of this missing middle housing, there are no garages. A lot of these homes were built before cars. So there's ways when it comes to parking that parking management can come in as opposed to an on-site requirement. I'm really concerned how an on-site parking requirement could impact the feasibility of this development that we're looking at. So yeah, that's my response at that point.
I'll add a little bit maybe to the second question about how the private sector responded. I think we heard a lot of different things from, different people in the same groups, right? Some realtors were happy with it. Some were very unhappy with it because they thought, the neighborhoods would change quickly and they would have fewer, single family homes to sell. Some of the home builders were happy, and some were actually quite upset with us because what we did actually was significantly reduce the size of house that you're allowed to build, no matter how many units are in it. And the reason I think that people had those different responses is because depending on how your policy works, it can be either an upzoning or a downzoning or both, right? We tend to think of upzoning as you can build bigger, you can build more. And for Portland, that actually wasn't true in the traditional sense. Before we did this zone change, on a typical lot in Portland, you could build a house that was 6,750 square feet, right? That's enormous on a 5,000 square foot lot. So what we did was we reduced that to about 2,500 square feet for a house. So that was a downzoning, a reduction in what you're entitled to build. At the same time, we said within that smaller footprint, you can build more units, which is in some ways an upzoning, right? So that kind of brings me to one of the key policy questions or one of the important policy points, which was the sort of striking the right balance between making sure that this new type of housing is feasible when it's appropriate, and not making demolitions happen too much, right? So the key to that was really sort of starting with a much smaller footprint, but then if someone wanted to build 2 units or 3 units or 4 units within a structure, allow them to have a little bit more space to work with, right? So let's say you start with 2,500 square feet for a 1-unit house. If you want to build a duplex instead, maybe you can go up to 3,000 square feet. That kind of increment actually turned out to be really important for making the project pencil or be financially feasible for the developer. So yeah, that was sort of the balance we were trying to strike, particularly around demolition of homes that low-income single-family renters were living in. So low-income folks renting single-family houses were the kind of the people that we were concerned about. And this was the first project that sort of operationalized the city's pretty new requirement to study displacement impacts of policy changes like this. And it was a really interesting process. We studied kind of one sort of channel of displacement, and we know that no report or modeling is ever going to be perfect, right? You just can't predict the future in a really exact way, but we found that the policy change would reduce anticipated displacement by 28%, which we thought was pretty significant. So yeah, that was really important. Another really important piece of that anti-displacement component of the project was a policy that a lot of our local housing advocates fought for. And it was basically a bonus. So if an affordable housing developer wanted to build homes that were affordable to folks making up to 60% of median family income. They could build 5 or 6 units instead of just 4. And, you know, we think that's going to be pretty rare, but the affordable housing developers that are working in Portland told us that was really important because it makes them a lot more able to compete for a particular piece of land with the private sector developers if they can build those extra units and keep them really affordable. So those were some of the things that came out of our work that I think are really important, and I would definitely encourage other cities to consider those as well.
Thank you. The questions are coming in rapidly. So while I sort out the questions from the audience, do you have questions for each other that you'd like to ask and clarify from, you know, maybe Greg for Lisa or Love or vice versa? Is there anything? Just giving you the chance to. Okay. I have a question for you, which is because I'm really interested in community engagement. And so I'd like you, all of you, if possible, to speak about, you know, how did you engage your communities? And especially, how did you adapt your engagement procedures to meet diverse groups of folks in our community, right? And you know, what were some of the challenges you experienced? So if you could speak to that, that'll be helpful while I assemble the next set of audience questions. Greg, maybe you want to start?
Sure. So we've been engaging for the past 2 years with our general plan update. So this was prime opportunity. We have a new environmental justice element that state law is requiring us to incorporate, which is, I think, is good practice anyways. But in doing so, we have the environmental justice working group that we meet with on a regular basis. And one of these, this is certainly a topic that we've been discussing with them, getting their thoughts on our outreach approaches as well. Our community-wide workshops, back when we could do an in-person workshop, was in disadvantaged communities, environmental justice areas. We would take our outreach events to those groups and try and use different times that are convenient for them, provide childcare and food and other things to incentivize people to attend pop-up workshops in various communities. Online, in terms of online during COVID, we had citywide workshops where for weeks people get on and answer questions and look at videos and the like. It was cell phone compatible. So we had 1,100 households participate in those workshops, a scientific survey of over 500 participants. We did a interest-based focus group with neighborhood association leadership. We've been in with this particular policy issue. It's newspaper, magazines, TV, radio. The amount of interest is really exploded. So it was not hard to get the word out. And then, of course, city commissions and committees. But one helpful thing that has really helped to clarify misconceptions and issues and the process is we just put out an FAQ, send it to the realtors. We have it on our website, attached to our staff report. I can put it here in the chat. And that FAQ has examples of what we call missing middle housing for people to see, to manage expectations, to speak to Love's issue of we're not going for these really big buildings. We're going for something that's kind of cute looking and affordable. So helping to clarify that. So, and of course, our council hearing got great participation, ton of people calling in, and I can post the link to that. Really impressive, the public testimony and just how much attention the item got.
Love, would you like to talk about the engagement question?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. It was a long road, lots of engagement, lots of channels. Started out with everything from, your typical open house, lots of emotions, was really a lot. And we did a number of other things, including sort of these more like a one-on-one style event where we would have people come in for like office hours. We would just set up at a library and let anyone come in and kind of chat with a planner, ask your questions either about your property or what do you think it's going to do in your neighborhood or for your community. And we actually were required by state law to send out a very scary looking legal notice to almost 200,000 people about this zoning change. So we set up a zoning hotline in response to that, where people could call us, ask questions, which was really interesting because we got everyone from developers to, people wondering what their neighbors were going to do. And we'd say, it's really not probably going to be that significant, or it might even be better if the thing you're worried about is a big building. And we got folks who, were speaking other languages, who were coming from like authoritarian countries, and they were afraid government's going to take their house, right? So it was a lot of like alleviating some of those fears when you get this scary looking notice in the mail, right? So we also did other sort of outreach, like just meetings with groups. We worked, like I said, closely with affordable housing developers, closely with anti-displacement advocates. And I'd say there were a lot of challenges. Some of them were, I think with work like this, like it tends to be focused on folks with more resources, more access to government, more experience engaging with government. So we found that a lot of our time was taken up by kind of a small number of people, or a very like not representative group of people. So we did our best to try to counterbalance that with other outreach. And I think it would have been better and kind of gotten everyone on the same page if we had really started with like, what is the history of our community? What are the problems that we're all seeing? How can we address them together, right? And that kind of happened after we started for us. So going back, I would have done things in a more, linear way, starting from the beginning. But yeah, I also will just say that since I left that position, I have actually started volunteering with one of our housing advocacy groups here that was really, really instrumental in getting this policy passed. And I will say I had no idea like how much work they were doing behind the scenes when I was on city staff. And it's been really amazing to see like the amount of outreach they were doing to the folks that the city couldn't reach, the amount of sort of organizing they were doing to turn out testimony, to really educate people about what the policy would and wouldn't do, and to really craft that deeper affordability bonus, which was actually an amendment to what the city had proposed. So I will just say, yeah, I mean, as much as folks are able to like work with their local activists, right, and use them as a channel to really get the word out and see what their input is, because it's useful. And that goes for any policy, right? So yeah, I'll leave it there. Greg, Lisa, do you have anything to add?
Or Love, what's the organization that was doing all that advocacy and work in Portland?
Yeah, so now the group is called Portland for Everyone. Now the group is called Portland Neighbors Welcome. The group, it is sort of the precursor to that group was called Portland for Everyone. And so it's morphed a little bit, but it's a lot of the same folks, some of whom are on this call. So hello. Yeah, happy to chat more if you want, Greg, offline.
Lisa, did you want to jump in about engagement at all?
I think I'll add a couple of things because our intentions were really similar, and I put a bit of a summary in the chat, a link to some of the public summary that was done. As a policymaker, I think it's really important that elected leaders are clear about our expectations, and then we have the back of our staff who are out at all of the meetings and doing all of this day-to-day work. So one of the things I think was really important is that we actually adopted, at my insistence, I think actually at the time staff was a little annoyed with me, like our planning staff, but I insisted that we adopt the community engagement plan through an official council action. And I felt that was really only fair to everyone, to the public, to our planning staff, to ourselves, to say, you know what, we're going to do community engagement differently this time. And our city was really used to every neighborhood sitting down with their zoning map and looking at their own zoning. We have 400,000 people. There's 78 different neighborhoods. So like very small neighborhood level planning, which is important, right? Those details are really important. But if you're only doing that neighborhood by neighborhood planning, you're really losing the bigger picture, and it can often create a lot of equity issues. So it was really important to be clear, we're going to do things differently this time, and the city council really means it. So people had a chance, council members had a chance to say, here are the stakeholders who are really important to me. And the business community was at the table, the developer community is at the table, the real estate industry folks are at the table. They're like practically are the table. We don't have to really work super hard to hear their voices in our process. But our renters, folks who don't speak English as a first language, low-income families who have their kids in our schools, who are facing constant displacement because of the way our housing market is working, their voices are equally important, and we're not at the table absent our true, clear commitment to bring them as true equal voices in the process. And we had to be really clear from the beginning that that's what we were going to do, and we were going to stick to it and not kind of revert back to how we usually do things. I think it was a cultural change for our city to, start by asking open-ended questions, have more of the citywide view, really focus in on our values and the policies as our starting point. So I think like some of the other cities, we also brought things through really incrementally, like Sacramento sounds like you just did. We adopted a framework with goals, and then we came back in and we did another incremental step. And only after we had this basis of why are we doing this? What are we hearing from our community? What problems are we trying to solve? Then we released a draft zoning map. So we were starting with what are the values and goals and priorities of our community, and how are we using these various tools in order to solve them. And I think it helped us build consensus. We also had a huge amount of different nonprofit organizations. And I think for all of us, staff, policymakers, and community leaders, to help folks link together their interest issue, whether it was our AARP organization interested in accessory dwelling units because they represent seniors who have needs for more flexible housing options, or Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, which is a renter advocacy organization, or transportation organizations, our environmental community. Everyone really came together, and I think between them sort of worked out how some of their own goals and priorities were influencing the process. But to see the connections between transportation and race equity and climate change, and housing, and aging, and all of these different issues, immigration, coming together around this one plan, there was a lot of work done at the community level, like in Portland, it sounds like, with advocacy organizations really leading a lot of those conversations across different focused topics or priorities.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks to Lav and Greg as well. The next question really relates to the intersections between housing and transportation. San Jose is autocentric, and I think our audience members and I are curious to hear a little bit about how the policies that you put forward in your communities and their success is related to the investments in public transportation. Just like the investments in infrastructure, how are the linkages either helping or how do they advance the opportunity housing agenda? Anyone?
I could start if you want. Yeah, this is a great question. Land use and transportation are so inherently linked. This was a really interesting journey for us as we were thinking about what types of missing middle housing would be allowed where. we started out with the intention to kind of keep it pretty closely tied in to our transit corridors. And so I think the original proposal was within a 1/4 mile of transit corridors. But as I was mentioning, kind of midway through the whole process, we really started to take a look at the history of single family zoning and the history of racism and planning in Portland, which in addition to single family zoning, you know, which was explicitly created to keep Black and brown folks out of white neighborhoods. There's also redlining at the federal level. There's also racial covenants, which were basically a way for people to get around the Supreme Court's knockdown of explicitly racial zoning. They had written into their deeds that certain racial groups couldn't live in the particular house that they owned. There's a long history in Portland and many cities of different levels of attention that white neighborhoods and black and brown neighborhoods got from the Planning Bureau and from all parts of city government. There's, you know, urban renewal, blight, eminent domain for things like freeways, hospitals, things like that. So we were finding that all of that history was really important, and we got to a point where you know, both our staff and our Planning and Sustainability Commission and our City Council, we're starting to think about, okay, if we're going to try to start to undo some of this history with our zoning by allowing more types of housing, do we really want to only keep it in the areas that are closest to transit, or do we think this is a thing that should be allowed everywhere, right? And so all those groups kind of landed on the thinking that the balance was actually right, that these things should be allowed everywhere, and that the impact on transportation would actually not be that significant. So we had, you know, a whole round of transportation impact analysis that we did, and found that it was definitely not going to break the transportation system by any stretch. So that's kind of the foundation. And then just to talk about parking, I think there's really some nuances that I would like to mention because I love nuances. Some of them are, so with what we did in Portland, we basically got rid of the minimum parking requirements in our single family zones. Some of the reasons for that were, someone mentioned not having a lot of garages. Portland has actually a fair number of garages, but this is kind of anecdotal, but pretty widespread. Most people don't actually park their cars in their garages, right? They're full of like kayaks and bikes and like tents and all this fun stuff that garages are useful for, but requiring someone to build a garage doesn't necessarily mean their car's not going to go on the street, right? So we didn't think it was right to require garages necessarily. We also see the street as a public good, right? Like if you are requiring someone to build a curb cut so that they can build a driveway, that's the same, you're taking the same amount of parking off the street. So you're basically just privatizing a chunk of the right of way for that person's driveway. So that seemed like not a good trade-off. And then I think most importantly, like every parking space you build is both less space for housing people, less space for trees, which was really important and a good alignment with our tree advocates, and also really expensive, right? So the surface parking estimates start at $15,000 and they only go up from there depending on the type of parking space you're providing. So yeah, I think between the question of where should middle housing be allowed, we landed on everywhere. And this question around parking, those were some of the big things we were thinking about with transportation.
I would just add, our general plan has been focusing a lot, and we continue to focusing our growth along our commercial corridors, centers, near light rail stations. But lately we've been looking at our high frequency bus corridors also, and increasing density, or FARs that in this case, along there, as well as discouraging or prohibiting auto-oriented uses near our light rail stations along those corridors. One of our key strategies we took to council, and that link I put in the chat, was a citywide lane reduction, just a map of where we propose to be eliminating lanes in order to create more space for pedestrian, bike, and transit infrastructure. So we can take care of that in one environmental impact report, all that traffic analysis, and then when the community and our city is ready, we move forward with the design and choosing what type of modes we want to prioritize based off of that area. So that is another key strategy we're taking forward.
We also have a lot of car trips in Minneapolis, but we have a good basic bus network. And I actually think our city has really benefited from concentrating growth near transit over decades, both for the transit to work better and to help build communities where folks can actually get around without a car. So that's certainly not everywhere in our city, and lots of folks are driving long distances to work or taking other trips that otherwise wouldn't make sense except for by car right now. But we've started to build light rail lines, and those have all had an accompanying land use component that concentrated housing into other destinations near transit, as well as right now our region is really investing in bus rapid transit for enhanced bus service. We're way behind other regions because of the politics of funding at our state legislature. It's like this hot button, like how to punish the city kind of politics. So transit funding is always this big negotiation. And but I do think there's a lot of value in thinking about how you can maximize the benefit of transit investments by really thinking about the land use piece at the same time. I love Denver. We learned so much from Denver, but they built transit without really addressing the land use near it. And so they have these really great trains that like don't connect people to things as well as they could. And so even if you're just dealing with simple bus lines as a starting place, then I think of it as all really iterative. So we had, we started investing in more transit. We reduced our parking minimums. Now we're about to eliminate parking minimums citywide as well. But people are still building, developers are still building parking. We're looking at more maximums. But the market is still building parking. Meanwhile, we're investing in transit and more people are taking transit because it's way better, fewer waits, just by putting in a simple bus only lane or even partial bus only lanes, we're seeing huge ridership gains from enhanced bus service. And again, like really marrying those two of land use and transportation is seeing the benefit of both of them enhanced. And we just adopted this new transportation action plan. And for really the first time, I think the city put forward what we really see as our vision for transit, instead of sort of pre-negotiating with our region and saying like, well, I guess the best we're going to get is a train that doesn't really connect to urban neighborhoods or these suburban commuter lines. And we just said, this is what we need for our city to thrive. And it's really those short trips. So again, in really car dominant cities like ours is, most trips are taken by car. There's tons of opportunity to make it easier and safer to walk and bike to the store or to school. These like 1 to 3 mile trips that people can feasibly take by walking or biking, and then, incrementally building on the transit system.
I'll just note that we're not walking away from cars. I mean, we have policies and general plan to avoid gridlock. We modeled the system as we're looking at reducing lanes to make sure things don't break down. Autonomous vehicles, we're looking at that, ride shares, curb management. It's all part of it, but I think we've been designing cities with cars as the priority, and now they are last when it comes to the different modes of transportation, which we took from Minneapolis. You have a great policy in the general plan on that. So,
thank you. We have a question from San Jose Parks and Recreation Commissioner Art Maurice, and he's just asking about how did Minneapolis, Portland, and Sacramento handle the densification of neighborhoods in relation to access to parks? Do the developers pay park fees for a duplex or a fullplex?
yes, they pay park impact fee, adjust our fees automatically based off of the increase in land value. So we just did that adjustment. That's going to be a bit of a shock to the system with developers. But yeah, council approved an automatic increase in those fees.
Yeah, in Portland, developers pay parks impact fees as well. And Portland just recently passed a pretty significant parks bond too, to upgrade some of our parks, build new parks, particularly in East Portland, which is historically underinvested in parks and transportation and all things. So that's going pretty well. And yeah, parks impact fees.
Right. May I jump to another topic now? I'd like to ask each of you to talk a little bit, to tell a story actually, of how you talked to someone who had a concern about densification, and or how you persuaded somebody to change their mind if they were sort of opposed. I mean, just to humanize it a little bit.
I think we've done a lot of clarifying. I don't know how easy it is you can persuade somebody when they're really set against something, but to let them know the process, how they can be involved in this. We're not just doing one vote. This is an iterative process where we're continuing to check in, getting people's input, providing visuals. Portland had a great visual of their different standards and all the different housing that they can allow. And just also in the development process, letting people know how they can get involved and the most effective way they can weigh in on projects. It's not like we're just going to allow these without any public input. We're going to make sure this is done right when we launch this.
Lisa or Love?
Yeah, I mean, as we started out with the beginning introduction, you know, people's homes and their neighborhoods are really emotional and folks are really invested in where they live. So I think we always try to listen to what people are saying. And also always keeping in mind that North Star of every single person in our city deserves a safe home and deserves the opportunity to be in a thriving neighborhood with amenities connected to their their jobs, their schools, the places that they're trying to get without risking their life trying to cross the street. So we have a lot of patterns in our city where some neighborhoods are doing really, really well and other neighborhoods are not. And so I think it's that combination of really hearing people and also I think just always kind of regrounding ourselves in those ultimate goals of making sure that we don't have the same patterns of disparity that we have seen for so many decades and that we're really taking seriously leveling the playing field in our city and opening up those options to everyone.
So it seems like the way you all encapsulated, it's really about explaining the motivation and the real commitment to rectify and challenge the historical wrongs and taking a stand and actually explaining that very clearly to the public seems to be important in each of your cases, right? So you're not shying away from engaging with that critical history, correct? And likewise, then you are actually explicitly saying that you are trying very hard not to privilege the car as it has been in the past. Yet many of the audience questions are really struggling with this, the current situation, not the the ideal future, but really the pragmatics of it. What do I do? What do we do? Because we still need our cars to get around, because the land use patterns are still autocentric, and especially for folks who are working and who need to carry equipment and tools and stuff around, it's not always easy to do on a bus or a bike, right? And so how do you sort of engage with those types of like real pragmatic questions? How did you all talk to those folks in your communities?
I can start. The questions around parking remind me a lot of kind of the overall question, right? Like, I think a lot of it is reminding folks that nobody is taking away your single family home. Nobody's taking away your car. Nobody's taking away your ability to build more single family homes, right? It's not a ban on single family homes. It's not even a ban on building parking, right? You can still build parking. You can still find a house with parking. I'd say also, kind of what I was saying earlier, the realities of most people in Portland, even if they do have a garage and a driveway, park in the street. There are some neighborhoods that are, you know, around really popular commercial corridors where it gets a little harder to park. But again, just kind of helping people think through like the trade-offs that the city thinks about, right? In terms of like, are we going to privatize this piece of right-of-way in front of your house for your driveway? Or, you know, maybe you have a neighbor who uses a wheelchair that actually needs more ready access to a parking space, right? So that's kind of one piece. And then of course I actually work for our city's transportation department now in active transportation. So encouraging people to bike and walk and take transit more, and supporting people in doing that. So I think we can't look at these things in isolation, right? There's a whole suite of policies and programs that are supporting people in driving less or owning fewer cars. And it is going to be a sort of really long process of making cars like a less significant presence in any American city. And of course, there are needs of folks who can't take transit for the reasons you were saying, Lakshmi, and lots of other reasons. And we're just not at a point in Portland, and I don't think we're going to be in a long time, where people find it so difficult to drive cars that it is preventing them from meeting their needs, right? A car is still the most convenient way to get around, still sometimes cost competitive, often time competitive, right? So as much as I would like to see that change really quickly, I don't think it's going to change really quickly. And what this zoning update really does for us is just allow more flexibility, right? If we're still seeing, as someone else was mentioning, like developers are still providing parking spaces, and they continue to do that even then when they're not required to. But if they don't want to, if they want to build a house that's cheaper, smaller, if they want to preserve a tree, they don't have to, right? So that's really what it's about.
I'll just note that every city, not just California, but throughout our country, we have to grow. We have to meet the demand for housing, and we're in this housing famine, I like to call it. The supply is not meeting demand, and so I really, it's about how you grow. Sacramento is the jobs center of our region. We are jobs rich. Adding more housing to the mix helps with reducing vehicle miles traveled, as opposed to adding another sprawling subdivision in the foothills and having people drive into our city to work. We've learned we can't keep widening our roads. It's just called induced demand. They'll just fill up again with more cars. It's unsustainable. So looking at alternatives, getting people closer to jobs, to amenities, that will help us get around. The car and the traffic situation, it's just not going to be getting any better. We have to grow, and it's just how we grow.
I think it can always be really helpful to combine both what we hear from community with data. So for us, we actually have parts of our city in particular that are very transit dependent. So families and individuals who are depending on transportation other than a car, who need some way to get around our city. And actually women, I see the comment about women actually bear a lot of the transportation burden for their families. So families without a car, there's academic research about this, end up with women on, hours and hours of very long bus trips. Certainly a very common experience in our city to see lots of kids on our public transit system. So for us, I think, again, it's about making sure that people can really hear from each other, because there are folks in our city that live a mile away, even in my own ward, who have totally different lives, totally different experiences living in our city. And I think it's really important that we hear from each other and understand, this is my particular experience. This is how I've gotten around our city. This is my experience of finding housing. And now I'm hearing from my neighbor who has a totally different experience than I have. And for us in Minneapolis, we've really made a commitment to centering the voices of folks who are having a harder time, who have experienced generations of racial inequality and racism, who are living in poverty because of many decades of decisions that have been made at every level of government, and really trying to focus our resources in supporting folks, again, to really try to level the playing field, to make it so that your zip code doesn't determine your kids' health or success in life, so that we're not having vastly different cities within a couple of miles of each other within our city's borders. And I've really found that when we can hear from each other, that's when we can really start to understand and open our eyes to, again, how different the experience might be for a mom who's just gotten a letter from her landlord that says you've got 2 weeks to decide if you want to pay 30% more rent, who maybe doesn't own a car, who's trying to get around with her kids, versus somebody else's experience that might be very different. And I think then we can quantify the real trade-offs too. So we've made some road improvements that have vastly improved safety for folks who are walking, that had zero impact on car traffic. In fact, may have actually improved both safety and travel time for cars. We've made transit improvements that created a huge efficiency in transit during the peak time when people are commuting, that had no impact on car travel at all. In fact, probably made it better because the bus wasn't swerving in and out of the car lane. So a lot of times, if you're really grounding in data, that's when you can, I think, really start to get at trying to quantify the trade-offs. If it's taking me 30 seconds longer to drive to work and a child can get to school safely, it might be worth that trade-off. Or sometimes there's a benefit for everyone.
I really appreciate how carefully and thoughtfully you all are responding to the questions, both from me and the audience. You haven't yet touched upon this directly, and it just came to me. You talk about the role of sort of the planning staff and their commitment to data and information assembly, communicating the narrative as clearly as possible, and being open and willing to answer a diverse set of questions. You talked about the responsibilities of community members who have to think outside of their, I mean, you didn't say it this way, I'm rephrasing it that way, that you ask them to think outside of their own individual experience and hear about other people's experience, so that they may think about the trade-offs more critically and wisely. The piece that none of you have actually touched on, is the role of the elected officials. And so it seems to me that we need to at least get some insights about that component, right? Like, how do you energize the elected officials? How do you engage the elected officials to take on, like Lisa, you said, it's quite challenging, right? And it's not a quick thing, but like, what is your advice and message, I guess, to elected officials in our community, and to move this agenda?
I can start, and then I'm sure the others have thoughts too. But I mean, taking on zoning and parking and transportation are some of the hardest political decisions facing local elected officials. So folks may support a federal policy about climate change, but when it's their own lives on their own street, in their own home, in their own neighborhood, it's different. And so no elected official can lead this kind of change without support. It's politically risky, but it's also possible. I was elected in my first campaign. I ran against an incumbent and I won with more than 60% of the vote. And then after leading these kinds of changes, I was reelected with more votes the second time. And we're slowly building more political support in Minneapolis. But it's only happening because of those efforts from grassroots organizations who are building and expressing community support for what we are doing. And in a really authentic way, in a way that's connecting the decisions we're making to people's experience in our city, in their day-to-day lives. I mean, we're making changes as we go. We're learning a lot from other cities. All of those things are true, but no elected official could lead this kind of work without support from their constituents and from, other community leaders.
Love?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say briefly because I'm the furthest away from elected officials out of the three of us, certainly. Just also speaking as sort of the most progressive member of the staff, I was always very pleased when our Planning and Sustainability Commission and certain members of our city council really pushed us to take this further. And as Lisa said, that would not at all have been possible without our grassroots organizations that I mentioned earlier and many others, really just sort of building that energy and just gathering the energy in community and getting folks turned out with really powerful testimony, both sort of writing letters and also speaking at city council hearings and things like that. So yeah, I appreciated seeing that from both sides, as both as staff and now as a community member advocating for these things.
Greg?
I can't speak for the elected officials, but I've been surprised by their leadership, how responsive they have been to these big policies. I think we have a homeless crisis, a housing crisis, just they're rising to the occasion, which is fabulous to see. And there's a lot of community support for this policy. I really thought it was going to be more controversial. We're going out, my principal planner in particular is going out almost weekly to neighborhood associations, and sometimes the elected officials go out with him and ask him real hard questions. But I think it's keeping them informed, giving them the materials and the resources to address their constituents. But again, it's the amount of supporters out there is really surprising. We had a neighborhood association that was just, the board was really against it. But the residents in the neighborhood signed a petition saying, "You're not representing my views." 30 of them. You listen to the public testimony at council on that link there. There's, I don't know, 30 something callers, and 2 of them were saying something negative about the policy. There's a lot of people that see the value in this. So it was surprising.
One of the things that struck me the most, I'm about to turn 43. And in our last public hearing for plan adoption, every single person who was my age or younger spoke about climate change with extraordinary urgency and are connecting the dots between the things that Greg was talking about developing communities very far out from the city center and very long car trips and climate change, and making the connection between energy efficiency in our buildings and climate change, and imploring us to take action. It was different. It was a shift. It was different than maybe, it was something we had heard about, but just the urgency that we were hearing folks come to us with that, in addition to really focusing in on our race equity issues, was really compelling to me. And I agree that this work is being driven by our communities, and folks are making the connections between all of these different issues and really demanding that we do more to step up and plan better for the future.
Wow. This has been a really engaging discussion, and we're right at the time where it's my duty to hand the conversation back to Alex, because we could keep going, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time.
Thank you so much, Professor Laxmi. That was wonderful moderating. Really appreciate it. Gosh, how lucky we were. Got to hear from a council president of Minneapolis, who, guess what, was trained in urban planning right here in the Bay Area. So lucky to have her back virtually. And thank you, Council President Bender. Appreciate it. Love, such a phenomenal perspective, being an advocate and working in city government and balancing those two roles and wearing those hats so deftly. Thanks for sharing your perspective. And Greg, your expertise as the head honcho in a changing, dynamic city like Sacramento that never gets its full due as a great urban place. So amazing to have you all here sharing your insights. We've got a big debate coming in our city that's already underway on these issues here in San Jose and across Silicon Valley. And it's just so helpful to have your perspective to inform ours. We're really, really grateful. I've got a couple slides just to close us out in case you want to engage with Catalyze SV or engage with our panelists who are so gracious to share their time today. So I'm just going to briefly do a screen share here and we'll get to this final little bit of good content. Is that showing up? The engage slide? Can you see that? Is the engage slide showing up?
Yes, it is. We can see it.
Cool. So, Catalyze SV does a lot of work through our volunteer committees, our community engagement committee, which works on making a more inclusive and collaborative community engagement process, like our panelists talked about tonight and the ways that they've done it in their cities. We also have a project advocacy committee that evaluates and scores development projects every month. And that meets, in fact, this week, this Wednesday, the fourth Wednesday of every month. So anyone's welcome to participate and our members vote on projects. You're welcome to get involved in both committees. It's super easy to get involved. You can sign up for our newsletter or any place on our website. Go and check out, learn more about what we are up to. We would love to have you all involved. You can also track us on all the traditional social media elements. So find us on there and let's talk, let's converse and stay in touch. And if you want to stay in touch with these outstanding human beings and experts in their cities and fields, here's their contact information that they were so kind to share with all of us. So everyone, thank you so much for being here. We will send you the video in the next few days so you can share that out if you'd like. And please stay involved in your community and continue to advocate for good development and a great community engagement process. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your night. Good night. And I'll stay on for a couple minutes if anyone wants to chat with me or Catalyze SV. I'm just going to turn off the live stream. And if anyone needs to chat with me, I'll stick around for a couple minutes. But we're done for tonight for the program. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Excite Credit Union. You rock.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Allie. Thank you, Kate. Appreciate you being here. We're all set. Bye-bye.
Alex, thank you for giving me the chance to moderate. This was a lot of fun,
Yeah.
and you selected amazing panelists. So it was a really good opportunity for me to get to know about this issue. As you know, we've just invited Kelly to join our faculty. She's going to be whispering in my ear about opportunity housing.
Good. That's a good person to be whispering. Yeah.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's
So we're very happy. And so anything else, let me know. And thank you again.
yeah, it was great to be with you, Lakshmi. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And
Keep up the-
Summer, thank you for your help and getting me the questions organized. It seemed to work well, but I think there's some more questions in the chat. Some of them came directly to me.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. I was just organizing the stuff that I saw in the general chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well,
Trying to think if there's anything else in the chat function. Looks like we're good. Summer, will you just follow up with me via text? We'll find a new time to chat and talk about next steps after tonight. And
sounds great. Okay.
thank you for
Bye.
thanks for your work.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Catherine, Tim, Kirk, I'm going to sign off unless anything you want to check in on. Thanks for being here.